sounds exhausting. Not quite sure how I managed that either. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming to listen to me tonight, and thank you very much, Matthew, for that very kind introduction. What I'm going to talk about tonight for this inaugural lecture really is sort of focusing back on my main area of research. I kind of, as you can imagine, I look through everything I've done over a career, which has been going on for a little while now. In fact, when I totted it up, it was rather longer than I often care to admit to myself. But I wanted to talk really about my main area of research, because a lot of what Matthew's just been talking about does feed into that. The area I've always worked on and always came back to has been rural settlement, sort of English villages, if you like, working on ordinary everyday settlements, and most of my work to date has been in England. And when you Google English villages, and I tried this afternoon just to make sure it worked, you know, they come out, they're pretty, they're kind of, you know, you always get these sort of picturesque ones, and in fact I was amused to notice the various sort of categories it suggested to you, which are picturesque, painting, Christmas, you know, so you get your villages in the summer, and then you get your Christmas villages. And they have a boring reputation. As Mick Aston, who was my colleague on Time Team, who's very sadly no longer with us, used to say, villages nestle. They nestle and they don't do anything. And he used to say, it's this forever Ambridge, and I can detect that there's a few Radio 4 listeners in the audience. So what I was interested in was this, which might sound slightly counterintuitive after I'd sort of finished at Cambridge, as Matthew had said. Most work being done on rural settlement at that time in the medieval period, and I was interested in the medieval period specifically, was focusing on deserted villages, which are the kind of sexy end of village studies, really. They're the ghost villages, the dead bodies of the settlement landscape. There's no one living there now, as you can see in these images, so the obvious question is, well, what happened? Excavation was taking place on various of these deserted villages, and had been for several decades when I started my professional career in the 1980s. The nearest one to here, or the best known one near to here, is Riseholme, which by an extraordinary stroke of good fortune, the University of Lincoln actually owns. Riseholme, which you can see the excavations of traces of some walls there, was excavated in the 1950s. It was the first ever deserted medieval village to be published in Medieval Archaeology, which is the kind of Bible for medieval settlement historians, or medieval archaeologists generally. So I was very familiar with Riseholme, even before I'd even thought, I think probably even before the University of Lincoln was founded, in fact. My career, I moved down to the West Country and was working from Salisbury for the Royal Commission on Historical Monuments of England, as Matthew has said. And my early specialism, we worked on sites of all sorts of different dates, and I have worked on monuments of various sorts from the Neolithic to the late 20th century, including places like Avebury Henge and the sites where the D-Day landing harbours were made. I'm not going to talk about either of those tonight. What I was interested in, again might sound slightly unlikely, was deserted and shrunken settlements, because that's what people studying settlement were working on. There were a number of sites which have been photographed from the air. And again, I'm not going to look at these in too much detail, but you can perhaps see there's some sort of changes in colour here. That's the remainder of a bit of settlement there. All these banks and irregularities there are the remains of former settlement. And I was working on these, doing a particular approach. I wasn't a great digger, really, particularly not at that time, but was working on earthwork survey, topographical survey. So this is the aerial photograph of one of these shrunken medieval villages. You can see there's some kind of pits and hollows and stuff there. And what I was involved in was doing very detailed analytical survey, recording the earthwork features in detail so they could be analysed. This would take weeks, but at least not years to do a single village. By contrast, excavating a medieval village can take anything up to about 30 or 40 years. So this was the quick approach. Nowadays it can be done almost in the blink of an eye by LIDAR, laser survey from the air. One of the things I was interested in was looking for new areas of deserted and shrunken settlement. And just to give you an idea, this is sort of Wiltshire, where I was working. This is the south of the county here. This was the number of officially known deserted and shrunken settlements that had been identified by 1968. And this is the same area, and you probably can't see the dots, so you might need to take my word for it. But each of these little circles is an area of these humps and bumps in the ground where we found new evidence of settlement desertion and shrinkage. And you can perhaps get some sort of an idea, particularly in this part of the county, how many more deserted and shrunken settlements there were when you actually started to look for them. That part of the county, was particularly characterised by more dispersed settlement. Previously, people had tended to focus on villages where you've got lots of people living together in one place. I started looking at that using the earliest maps we had available for the whole county. This late 18th century map provided a great deal of detail, and you could see a contrast between the sort of areas where you've got these very linear, regular villages. These don't arise by chance. Somebody's made the decision to lay that out like that. And then other parts of the county where the settlement was much more strung out. You can see you've got a little farm there, a couple of cottages there, all strung out along the lanes. So you've got different forms of settlement. I mapped all of these in one of my earlier publications, and you can see in the sort of north of the county and this area in the southwest of the county here, you've got these dispersed open settlements here. This was published in a early paper of mine, in a volume edited by myself and Mick Aston. That Michael Aston is the same as Mick Aston of Telerepute. Mick used to publish his academic papers as Michael and his television papers, or his television books, as Mick. Just as one example of the sort of way I was looking at things then, in the north of this area, again, you might be able to see there's a distinct line of these are all bits of settlement around the edge of what was very clearly a particular area of forest. You can see perhaps that shape is the same as that shape. The settlement there was fringing the edge of the forest. And I looked into that, trying to see if changes in the forest boundary could help us date these dispersed settlements, because we didn't have any dating evidence for them. I had a look at the kind of records to see what dates the various places were, but they're only the dates at when they appeared in the record. We had no archaeological evidence at all. So we could infer that there might be sort of certainly Anglo-Saxon dates to some of these place names, but you don't know whether anybody's actually living there. So we could get hints of how old that settlement pattern was, but no really very definite evidence. Off the back of this research, I then spent some time at the University of Birmingham doing a postdoctoral research fellowship, which was looking at settlement origins and development in central England. So obviously any of Wiltshire's down here. So I was kind of moving east and north. And this was a 3-year project looking at 4 counties, Buckinghamshire, Bedfordshire, Northamptonshire and Leicestershire, trying to look again at what are the origins of these settlements? What's the origins of the settlement pattern? There was still a great interest then in the origins of the nucleated village. At what point had people decided they were going to all move out of this sort of scattered pattern of settlement that we could see in the early and middle Anglo-Saxon period into villages where everyone's living together? We used this same sort of evidence from maps, again, rather like I did in Wiltshire, contrasting the sort of nucleated villages of different forms with the dispersed settlement. We mapped this. I mapped this across the whole 4 counties. And then we took those 4 counties. This is sort of 40 kilometres is that scale. So it's a big area, a lot of dispersed settlement in the south and scatters of it in the Charnwood area of Leicestershire. And we compared it with the geology, the topography, the drainage, the sort of natural landscape. We looked at the archaeology, or the archaeological evidence that was there. This told us really more about where the archaeologists have been working. There's clearly a lot of archaeologists working around here. And we also looked at the historical evidence, the population from Domesday Book, lordship, did the sort of lord make a difference? And published that as Village Hamlet and Field. And this, is still one of these extensively cited books. I think it's just lodged itself on everyone's sort of bibliographies, but it generally appears in most publications. What that really did, though, was it moved debate and discussion in academic terms on from the search for a sort of single monocausal big explanation for the origins of the nucleated village, why people had decided to move in all to one place. We recognise there's a general tendency towards these sort of blueprints and accepted ways of doing things that appears in the late Anglo-Saxon period and becomes more evident in the period between about sort of Norman conquest to the Black Death broadly. But there's no single factor. There's no kind of, people have been looking for this, it was caused by lords replanning, or it was caused by peasants wanting to maximise their agricultural production, or it's caused by the Normans wanting to stamp authority. There is no single explanation. And I think what Village Hamlet and Field did was sound the final death knell, if you like, of this search for the monocausal explanation. What it also did was it highlighted, certainly for me, as the archaeologist on the project, the two colleagues on the project, my colleagues on that project were both historians, and we were actually in the School of History at Birmingham, not the School of Archaeology. But it did highlight the limitations of the archaeological evidence and the map evidence as well. You were constantly up against the fact that you didn't really have any very good evidence for whether the recorded name of a place meant there was anything actually going on in that place at that time. So I then moved on. My next area of interest was looking at currently inhabited rural settlements in eastern England. So this again, in terms of the drift, you can see I started off in Wiltshire, then moved up to this area, and then ended in this area. You might think a move to Lincolnshire is kind of almost obvious from that trajectory. It was either Lincolnshire or the Netherlands. I'll come back to the Netherlands. The reason I was interested in this was because what I wanted to look at was the places that people were still living in. One of the problems with the archaeological evidence was that most of it was coming from deserted sites like Riseholme. On the whole, excavation had been quite limited because most villages hadn't had time to have 30 years of excavation done on them, as you could imagine. And in places like Riseholme, very little evidence had been found for anything before about 1200, 1250. And we didn't know whether the deserted sites were typical. They're certainly atypical in that there's nobody living there now, and 90% of medieval villages are not deserted. So those deserted sites like Riseholme are an atypical minority. But they're also possibly atypical in their origins and development. Is there some reason why those places get deserted, which means they're not typical? Is it like doing a population study and only looking at animals that died at the age of under a year's age? Are they typical, or is there something wrong with them? So I wanted to look at the places that people were still living in. I didn't initially intend to do quite this many places. It was a project that built up. But Houghton and Witton was one of the villages we looked at in the very first year in 2005, digging, as Matthew has already said, mostly with school children, 13, 14, 15-year-olds, which are a great age group to work with, actually. They've got lots of energy. They are very happy to get on with something when they're being asked to do something a bit odd. And being taken to someone's garden, because, of course, digging in villages like Houghton that you can see there, it's not like working up, on somewhere like this where you've got an open landscape and you can dig wherever you want so long as the farmer's given permission and the site's not protected as a Scheduled Ancient Monument. Digging in places like this, you're very restricted in where you can get to. And this is why people hadn't really attempted it very much before. So for these kids, we essentially gave them a briefing about how to dig. We gave them a map and a set of equipment. And they would go off, find their garden, double check that we really did want them to dig a hole in this garden, and then get cracking with that. What we did was use a standard methodology. So each of these test pits, these mini digs, they're all 1 metre square, and they're squeezed in where you can fit them, mostly in people's gardens, and some pictures there to give you an idea. Each pit is dug in 10 centimetre layers. The fines from each layer are kept separate. All of the soil is sieved, unless it's really, really clay, in which case it's sort of sorted by hand. And then the fines are identified and dated, and we can then use those fines, as Matthew has explained very elegantly, we can use those fines to give us some idea of whether that particular spot of land has been inhabited by humans, when that inhabitation first happened, whether it's likely to be habitation, whether it's likely to be something else, and what dates it continued until. The great thing about this methodology is you can do it anywhere. Anybody in this room who's got a garden that's larger than about 3 metres square could fit a test pit in. I'm not suggesting you have to, but they are very small. It's a very nimble technique for getting at those places, those settlements which have not become deserted. This strategy, this method, was actually pioneered by Mick Aston, again, and he has been a great influence on my career. He was the first person who's probably mad enough, really, to try this in a village. These 1 metre square excavations have been carried out in sort of open landscapes where people were looking to define either the extent of a site, usually a prehistoric or Roman site, because they tend to be the ones that are in open landscapes. People are trying to find out how far it went or what depth the sort of archaeological layers were at. And in fact, when I was in my third year as an undergraduate at Cambridge, I spent the summer doing test pit excavations on an open landscape. So I had done it before, but that was for Neolithic stuff, and it was about 1 metre down. You just dug down till you got to the layer, recorded it and backfilled. Mick tried it in a village, an inhabited village, Shatwick in Somerset, published as Interpreting the English Village there. And I'm very aware you can't see the map here, but this essentially shows the results. The circles here are showing which sites produced pottery. The bigger the circle, the more pottery. It is an impossible image to photograph. It's fairly faint in the actual original publication. By the time you've taken an image of it to reproduce, it gets even worse. Nonetheless, this was tried again in 2003 for Time Team's Big Dig. This is the only reference I'm going to make to Time Team, so if you're coming here really for the glamorous, reflected glory of television, you can leave when I finish this slide if you want to, but I hope you won't. 2003, but by 2003 we spent 10 years doing Time Team, and we're getting a fairly steady stream of hundreds a year of letters from members of the public saying, "Dear Time Team, can we come and dig with you?" To which we'd have to say, "No, sorry," politely but nicely. So Big Dig, the idea of that was it would give members of the public the chance to dig by giving them a digging pack, and they dig 1 metre square wherever they fancied it, and you can see the sort of places that people fancied it. It's a Channel 4 series who would run its soap opera then, Brookside, which some of you may remember, had a storyline not very long before we did this about a body being discovered under a patio, so there was a lot of hopes were high for that particular pit. Anyway, the great thing I learned from this partly was I knew the methodology, but the thing I learned, I think, more than anything else from Time Team was how to manage a big, complicated project with lots of different people. So we started work on this, and what I'm going to do now is just show you some of the data that's come from this and the use we've made of it, because of course what we're interested in, what I was interested in, was what this would tell us about these inhabited villages. So this is Purton, it's in North Hertfordshire, it's not far from Hitchin, if any of you know that area. And on this map, rather like the ones I showed you of Mick's, Shatwick, for all of this, each of these white squares is a test pit which didn't produce any pottery for whatever the date is. So this is the mid-1st to the early 5th century AD, commonly known as the Roman period. For any pits which did produce pottery, they're shown as black circles, and again, the bigger the circle, the more pottery. Generally, as a rough horizon, we reckon if there's 5 sherds or more, then you've definitely got, say, very likely to have people living nearby. That's a lot of pottery to get from a 1 metre square. If you've only got 1 sherd, particularly if it's a very small one, it's probably more likely to be, anyway, non-intensive use, like manuring of arable fields, taking the sort of manure out from the muck heaps in the village and spreading them on the fields to maintain fertility, or something like that. If you've got 2 to 4 sherds, somewhere in the middle, it's more than you'd expect from manure spreading, but maybe not quite as much as you'd expect from intensive settlement. Anyway, so what you can see from this, here you've got Purton, you can see the map of today's village, you can see precisely how far that extends. Main core of the nucleated village, there's a church there, there's a motte and bay, well, it's the motte of a castle there, there's earthworks presumed to be to do with the castle bailey in that area. As you'll notice, there are no test pits in that area at all. It's a scheduled ancient monument, so we can't dig there. There's a slight irony about this, that actually we now know less about that area than we do about the rest of the village. That said, it's perfectly intact, it's not going anywhere, and therefore leaving it intact is probably a reasonable strategy. I say that just in case there are any people from historic England here in the audience. It is a good strategy. I still think it would be quite interesting to do a little bit in there. Nonetheless, the patterns you can see are still, I think, very interesting. So in this Roman period, we've clearly got a settlement right just beyond the edge of the existing village. It looks like a linear settlement aligned along one side of this stream, which is draining to the northeast here. Appears to be another small area of perhaps cottages, perhaps a few outlying buildings in this area, and nothing under the footprint of the existing village. And you can see the number of test pits we've dug there, very few of them producing really anything at all. Interestingly, we've got a good scatter there of very small single finds of pottery from the test pits, and it looks perhaps as if this may be where some of the fields from that Roman settlement are on the edge of the village there. So we can then, of course, move forward in time. And the great thing about using pottery for this is it's very, it can be dated easily visually by an expert, and I always have used an expert. For those of you who were Time Team fans and remember somebody called Paul Blinkhorn, who used to turn up and do pottery occasionally. He rode a motorbike, was a sort of strident Liverpudlian with shaved head, tattoos, and a passion for medieval pottery. He went down brilliantly with our school kids, who just couldn't. It's so counterintuitive to expect someone who roars up on a motorbike, leaps off, a shaven head, tattoos, and then starts rhapsodising about late Anglo-Saxon pottery. Anyway, so what you can do is then identify pottery of different dates. So moving forward in time into the period after the end of the Roman period in Britain, so the sort of early Middle Anglo-Saxon period, we can then see what happens to both of these settlements, this one here and this one. And it's very, very, oops, hang on, sorry, dramatic impact loss there, okay. So you can see that actually none of the pits in this area are producing even a single sherd of pottery of that date. In fact, in all of these pits, and there's over 100 have been dug there, there's only one has actually produced any pottery dating to the 400 years after the end of the Roman period, and it's down in this area. So it's quite close to where that southern bit of the Roman settlement was, in that same general area. But that's the only point at which there's any sign of continuity. There's certainly no evidence that this large nucleated village had an early or middle Anglo-Saxon origin. And this had been suggested that many of these nucleated villages originated in the early Anglo-Saxon period some decades ago. The date we could pin the foundation of the village down to very clearly was the late Anglo-Saxon period, the 9th to 11th century, about 850 to 1050 AD, broadly from King Alfred the Great to the Norman conquest, if you were King Kings. And you can see here very clearly big cluster of pits producing large amounts of late Anglo-Saxon pottery here, and another very marked cluster down here. This is to some extent exaggerated by the fact some allotments there, and the villagers got very into digging the allotments. Doing test pits there. So we've got a bit of a cluster there. Nonetheless, all of the pits are producing large amounts of pottery. And that points up the possibility that this Motte and Bailey castle, which is itself, of course, Norman in origin, because the Normans introduced castles, that it was, that there's some late Anglo-Saxon high status something there, maybe an Anglo-Saxon thane's residence. We could trace this forward and see how the village grew in the Norman period and the 12th century. And you can see that that sense of kind of energetic expansion. The settlement is bigger, much more pottery is being used. It suggests there's many more people living there, and that the economy, if you like, is booming. Odd gaps, it looks like we might have a green in the middle of that village, the village there, just for the current duck pond. And this street here seems to be beyond the edge of the settlement. You can see how this technique is enabling us to see how this village developed. We have no evidence for this at all, above ground or from any other archaeological records. We could then carry it forward and see what happened after about 1350. There's a bit of a hiatus in pottery production and styles in the 14th century, middle of the 14th century. And we could see what happened after this was a dramatic decline. If I do that before and after, you can see the extent of that decline. Now, this is before and after the 14th century, which is a period of the Black Death. What we seem to be seeing here is the impact of that demographic decline. And this is a sustained period of time. Pottery, these bits of pottery aren't dropped by people grabbing a couple of agonising buboes and dropping dead and breaking the pottery as they go. This is long-term change. Pottery doesn't pick up sort of overnight events. This is showing the impact of that 14th century demographic collapse on this settlement, because it's not for another 200 years that the settlement picks up at all, at which point it's very different. If I go back to before the Black Death, and then when it eventually recovers, even 400 years later, it still hasn't reached its pre-Black Death heights. And the settlement is very much just extended along this street and in this kind of core area near the castle. And we can see here how much this reflects the layout of the earliest mapped settlement. But that earliest map actually doesn't reflect what's going on in the medieval period at all, let alone the Anglo-Saxon. This is a little depressing for somebody who'd actually spent some of their early time using maps to reconstruct settlement pattern. So I'll just give you another example, and I'll draw some bigger pictures out of this. This is Carlton Road up near Norwich, sort of central Norfolk area. Very little from the Roman period there. The church is here at Carlton Road, but as you can see, it's a much more dispersed landscape, and we've got test pits all across that landscape. Very little Roman material at all. Bizarrely, exactly the same amount of early Middle Anglo-Saxon pottery as at Purton, one tiny node of activity there. Into the late Anglo-Saxon period, we can see this settlement being founded at this time, but we can also see colonisation or intensive use of these dispersed parts of the settlement as well. Now, these are, you can see the names there, perhaps a Poplar Farm, the Boundary Farm, Ash Farm, White Lodge Farm. These are all very modern names. There's no evidence in any of the place name data that these are settlements of Anglo-Saxon origin, or indeed of medieval origin, indeed of pre-19th century origin. We could see, again, as at Purton, the settlement grows, so that sense of really, after the Norman conquest, huge amount of energetic growth in the main settlement here, in these outlying areas, out on the edge of the common here. Bizarrely, very little around the church. The church is under here. It's a medieval church, but there's nobody living around it. Again, we wouldn't know that without this data. And again, as in Purton, we can see the impact of the 14th century demographic collapse. Again, that's before and after. And we can see, again, many of these outlying places are as badly affected. It's just at this point, perhaps we start to get a little bit more material turning up near the church. But actually, it's not really until we get into the 16th or 18th century that we see the settlement around the church actually coming into existence, by which time the dispersed pattern of settlement across the landscape has appeared like it looks like a rash of Black Death buboes, really, doesn't it? But I should change the colour. And then just as a final example, because this is a very different period, this is Matthew mentioned this and I wanted to just cover it, that same strategy, those 1 metre squares, was used here on a settlement of very different date. It's on the edge of Gainsborough, for those of you that know Gainsborough. We haven't done test pit excavation throughout the whole of Gainsborough, just on this one area, which is a post-war social housing estate, council estate. We did excavations. We were interested in these green spaces that were designed to be an antidote, if you like, to the Victorian back-to-backs, where there's no green space, no safe space for children to play or people to congregate. And we did excavations on these. The green ones are on these green spaces. The ones of other colours, as you can see, are on various other locations. Bizarrely, completely unexpectedly, because we were really looking at the 20th century landscape, we found a remarkably large amount of this 17th, 18th century pottery. The colour's a bit different here, but you can see here the test pits with 5 sherds or more are blue, the 2 to 4 sherds are green, and just 1 sherd is yellow. And you can see, this is an open field. It's called Middlefield Lane. That comes from the medieval open field system name. There's nothing on any maps showing any habitation in that area. But if we compare it to Purton, and you've seen this before, but here's Purton using the same colour conventions, for that same date, 16th to 18th century, you can see it's in the centre of the village, you're getting that 5 and more. On the edge, you're getting much less in the way of pottery. You're actually getting more out on this remote site, up on the hills on the edge of Gainsborough, than we're getting from the edge of a fairly intensively inhabited village. What we also looked at Middlefield was the 20th century material. We discussed, yes, identify, those of you who aren't experts in 18th century pottery can probably identify some of the finds here. The iconic, various of them are very familiar. But items like bits of toy soldier, marbles and so on are very identifiably child-related. We mapped those and discovered that the test pits on the greens, which are all of these ones in the middle here, were all producing large numbers of child-related finds. But what was really valuable was the fact that because we had the data from the villages, so this is all these village gardens, we've done more than 2,000 of these metre squares in these villages, we could compare the number of child-related finds on average per test pit with Middlefield Lane, and we could see we were getting 4 times as much child-related material from this estate, showing that that sort of plan with its open air space did work, was an appropriate design. Now, just to pull this together a little bit, what we have from this is that the test pitting methodology, remember I wanted to look at the inhabited settlements, it almost is like taking the pulse of these settlements. So this is Roman, this is the early Anglo-Saxon period, this is the late Anglo-Saxon period, the Alfred to the Norman Conquest, this is the high medieval period from the Norman Conquest to the Black Death, this is from the Black Death to more or less Henry VIII, and this is the early modern period, as it were, the 16th to 18th century, sort of Elizabeth, Queen Victoria broadly. And you can see the ebb and flow. Not all of the settlements disappear, but that's clearly a period that's producing much less. Complexities with that, which I won't go into now. But what we can see very clearly is the drop after the 14th century, but it doesn't affect all settlements. And we can calculate this for every single place, and we can map this. You can see in Norfolk, which is this sort of area around here, you can see how the trajectory, nearly all of the villages follow a similar trajectory. Not a great deal of Roman material, very little Anglo-Saxon, growth from the Anglo-Saxon up to the high medieval, and then a drop. They're all seeing a decline then, and then it picks up again. Suffolk, on the other hand, is all over the place. Very, very different pattern of impact in Suffolk, even extending right back into the Roman period. Now, I'll show you a couple of slides, just looking at one of these stories, because I published a paper on this recently. This is this 14th century demographic crisis. There's a number of setbacks in the 14th century. It's an era of climatic cooling. It is also an era of political instability, and it is also a period when there's a number of endemic diseases and famines, all of which kind of exacerbated each other in a way I won't go into now, simply so I don't have time. But we can see this. This is before the 14th century. Purton that I showed you is here. Carlton Road is here. That's before the 14th century. You can see Purton is just one of dozens of villages that are big, tightly packed, densely packed, nearly all of the test pits producing large amounts of pottery. And a similar pattern up in North Norfolk there. After the 14th century, you can see how this whole landscape here is, I mean, it's not even decimated. Decimated would be 1 in 10. It's eviscerated. in terms of the impact on these settlements. And again, North Norfolk similarly. Certain areas are exceptions, and of course exceptions are always interesting. But overall, when we looked at the data, 90% of the villages that we'd carried out this excavation in showed a decline in the number of pits producing habitative levels of pottery. And in fact, overall, the number of habitative sites drops by, on the last count, 44.7%. So about 45% perhaps, accounting for year-on-year averaging. We can actually use that as a separate set of data to assess the impact of the 14th century demographic crisis on the population of this part of England, and it's about a sixth of England. And that's important because we don't have documentary evidence that enables us to do that. We have a small number of manorial records that give us a head count. Apart from that, we're reliant on tax evidence, which not only has all of the problems of are their tax records accurate, but actually also has the problems of they're taxing people differently before and after the Black Death. What we can see when we map this, these green settlements, these are the ones that are actually growing at that time. And we can compare the settlements where we're seeing contraction with the distribution of deserted settlements. So these are the settlements that I decided I wasn't going to look at because I thought they might be atypical. In fact, when we look at the areas where the settlements that are growing, they're very much in different areas to where the deserted settlements are. And when we put our shrinking settlements, those are the ones that are in red, we can see that they're in those same areas where we've got deserted villages. So actually the deserted settlements aren't so much atypical, they're just the tip of the iceberg. What we must now see from the work that I've done here is that in the late medieval period, these settlements are almost universally severely depleted with empty plots, and in some cases they're contracted by 50, 60, 70% in terms of size. And we see this also, most of this work has been carried out in eastern England, but we have strayed a little bit beyond this into various settlements in here. And you can see again, right from Yorkshire down to Hampshire, we've got that same pattern, differently exaggerated, well, differently felt in some areas compared to others. So when we're looking at these questions of what has this all told us, remember I was looking at these currently inhabited rural settlements. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, but it has advanced our understanding of how these settlements developed, for which we had no knowledge really before at all. We had the maps, we had the place names, we had perhaps the odd medieval building, the church, and we had some later documentary evidence. There's a consistent lack of Roman material, and that is what I'm currently working on, trying to understand that. I'm starting to suspect that when these villages are founded, they're avoiding the Roman sites. We get so little Roman material, and Roman Britain was densely populated. You'd expect more of that. We can see that energetic intensification of the landscape in the late Anglo-Saxon period, as we saw at Purton. And it's showing us that many settlements have earlier roots, much, much earlier in many cases. So, like at Carlton Road, you can see those outlying parts of the landscapes producing pottery 1,000 years earlier than any documentary record of settlement on those spots. We can see the impact of the Norman conquest and the Norman period generally on the landscape, that intensification of settlement, of habitation, of population. Historians have estimated that population perhaps tripled between the Norman conquest and the Black Death. Certainly that's well reflected in what we see, but we now know where. We can see where the people were living at that time. We have new metrics for the extent of the 14th century collapse. And we also have a recognition that that collapse was felt for much longer. Previously, people have tended to say that the non-deserted settlements are one that, they didn't feel much impact. They might have been a generation, perhaps 50, 20 years, perhaps even just a year or so, and then they recovered. We can see that's not the case. And we have a new understanding of how the early modern settlement pattern has developed as well. We can see the impact that this collapse had as settlements collapse around their churches, or some settlements actually sort of fragment out into the landscape. But we can see individually, place by place, how they developed. And we can also see how the earliest mapped plans are actually, in many cases, of comparatively recent origin. We can't use them accurately to identify what the settlements looked like before. It's also generated data sets and analyses against which any other research can be done. So anybody now digging a test pit can compare what they find with the data we've got. It is also a methodology that can even tackle recent periods, as the work at Gainsborough showed us. And it's also improved our knowledge of the archaeological resource. It's giving us a better idea of where archaeological evidence, archaeological deposits are likely to be underneath the places that people are living in today. I'm just going to quickly skim now to finish off through the publicly engaged aspect of this, because, as Matthew pointed out, and as I said at the beginning, these 2,500 test pits are not ones that I've personally dug. They are ones that have been dug by probably around 10,000 people who've been involved in this project over the years. And we have seen the impact it's had. Matthew again has alluded to this, but we have the data for this from staff who we will survey all staff who come with schools to see what impact that taking part has on the students. And you can see the sort of categories that we're looking at there, particularly in terms of feeling positive about going to university. And in Lincolnshire, for instance, in 2015, we ran one of these. Considering Lincolnshire has some of the lowest rates of progression to higher education, red is the lowest, yellow is average, and dark blue is above average here. And you can see Lincolnshire is rather like East Anglia, which is why we did so much of this work in East Anglia when I was at Cambridge. You can see you've got an area where progression rates to the university are low, and you can see before Heifer and after Heifer the impact that experience of 3 days taking part in this excavation had. Collected statistics, this was from 11 years, there's been about another 3 years of the project since then, since I left Cambridge. You can see 84% of these 5,000 students feel more positive about university, and more than 80% feel that it helped them develop specific skills. And we know what those skills are. We worked with the OCR exam board to identify those skills and work out how to assess them in these various categories. And I won't go through this in detail, but we have very detailed descriptors for all these various skills broken down, 2 different categories of verbal communication and so on. So we know the impact it has. And we also know the impact it has on wider communities as well. We see when we used to go back to places, people would put little exhibitions together. This sign, you can't see this here, it says many more digs could be coming. It sounds like sort of, a new Waitrose being announced or something like that. But you can see this sort of sense of people getting excited about what was going on. And again, we would assess the impact that participation had on members of the wider public. These are people who live on the Gainsborough estate, who did the digging there. You can see here the numbers, the percentages strongly agreeing that they feel they know more about the history and archaeology of the estate, they feel more engaged with it, they'll be more interested in the estate in the future and in archaeology and heritage generally. And again, skills, these same sets of skill categories. With adults, again, we have that same strongly agree. The green and the turquoise, you can see very heavily weighted towards this, including certain categories. You can identify that. Working persistently hard, being a good team member is where it's particularly effective. And I'll just put in a couple of pictures of this because we did this last weekend and some of you may have come and visited. But that sense of a project which you can engage wider publics with is something we took into the Waterside Shopping Centre on Saturday and had both sort of displays with information and finds. The eagle-eyed of you may be able to spot the curly-whirly wrapper there. And a fantastic test pit dig using a lot of yoghurt pots. And we had large numbers of people come along to that. Most of you were there will be aware how busy this was, of all sorts of ages. And it was actually featured on the launch of a national humanities research festival in London when I had all the austere academics doing dig bingo up on the stage there. And this legacy of this sort of engaged research is something I'm really very enthusiastic about and very committed to. We've seen across East Anglia, where we had dozens and dozens of projects in scores of villages, community groups carrying out new activities. So they start off doing some test pit digging, then they'd get interested in the local enclosure, they'd do some geophysical survey, then got permission to excavate it. And even designed a fantastic cake. If you look very carefully, you can see how the features in the cake here actually matches the excavated features there. We've actually had new community groups have founded because people have got to meet each other, got to know each other, enjoyed taking part in this sort of work. And we've also got new test pit projects across the UK. And of course, they are generating more and new data. So to summarise, over more than 25 years, demoralisingly, my research, which has always really focused on unremarkable. I had my hair cut the other day, which doesn't happen very often, and the guy who was cutting my hair said, "Oh, so what's the most exciting thing you've ever found?" I don't do exciting. I mean, mostly it's unremarkable bits of grey, scrubby pottery from the ordinary places that many of us live in, and we will all know. But looking at those hidden histories, it's used new techniques, and what I really have done is use these on an unprecedented scale. At Shapwick, there were 80 test pits excavated over a period of 5 years. As I say, we've done more than 2,000 of them now, all part of this bigger project. We've unearthed this data, new data, for the development of settlements that we can actually put into place and use it to look at historical development, connecting it where it's appropriate with events such as the Black Death, and actually reconstructing the things we don't know in other situations. And the importance of this is it's freed us from the confines of that absent documentary record that I was referring to at the beginning. When I started off my career was looking at sort of earthworks and maps, and you could get possible explanations, but you had no evidence, you had nothing to test your deductions against. This strategy has enabled us to actually start to say, well, have we got any evidence of the Anglo-Saxon origins of this settlement or not? This analysis can actually be done street by street, plot by plot. You know, you could all go home and do one of these in your garden. You could bring me in everything that had come from it, and we would be able to get that dated and could compare it. You see, when you've got more Roman pottery than most people get, or less Anglo-Saxon pottery, don't please all do that at once. But and then synthesising these individual case studies has, of course, enabled us to look at these bigger pictures and looking at really major national, international, historic and demographic phenomena. The Black Death raged across the entire of the Old World, from Ireland to China. And we have no idea what its impact was like in India and Africa, but we suspect it got there. This is a methodology that's been able to illuminate our understanding of these major global or semi-global events. And it's also demonstrated how much evidence is out there. I'm in the School of History and Heritage here. I work with historians all the time. The great advantage, and I don't say this to Crow in particular, but the great advantage of the archaeological evidence is while it's not infinite, there is a huge reservoir of evidence we simply don't know still to be discovered. And my work has demonstrated that, I think. And at the same time, these publicly engaged strategies have actually enabled us to demonstrate, or to achieve wider impact, to demonstrate that impact and to disseminate knowledge of it, showing the value of university research, not just for enriching people's lives by helping them understand the place they live in better and understanding its history, but also by developing new skills and aspirations for the future. And in February, 1st of February of next year, we are starting a project extending this across Europe. I alluded earlier to the fact that Lincolnshire was the obvious next place for me to go to, or I was going to have to head east. We will actually be carrying out test pit excavation in rural communities to look at the way this wider social impact can be delivered through involving members of the public in investigating historic settlements in the Netherlands, the Czech Republic and Poland. So actually the easternward drift is still being maintained. I should probably end up in Russia and China. and I have had conversations about that as well. And just to go back to the Forever Ambridge, I have even published a paper on the archaeology of Ambridge from test pit excavation in academic publication. So that really is where I've got to with my research now. It's wonderful to be here in Lincoln, able to continue that, and it is wonderful to have the support of a university like Lincoln, which is not only committed to world-class research, but also to making sure that research has impact to wider society. So, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that